You're listening to The Sweep with yours truly, Ali Haidar.
And I'm Cole Townsend. Let's get into it.
On May 7th, the governor of Georgia signed the Heartbeat Law, which outlaws abortion after 5 to 6 weeks and establishes fetuses as full people under the law. Basically, the law has personhood provisions, and they basically include some really weird stuff, you know. And we're talking about this because this week has just been extremely, extremely disheartening in terms of women's rights and, you know, for the pro-choice movement in the southern part of the country. And so Georgia passed this law, and it's weird. They have personhood provisions, and in these personhood provisions, fetuses can be claimed as dependents for tax purposes. Fetuses are also now going to be counted in official population surveys. And essentially the law dictates that women who perform their own abortions after this threshold, or even during it, can be charged with first-degree murder. And so what's interesting about this law, and the reason why it's made so much ground and news, is because it defines fetuses as people through these provisions. And basically when you define something as a person, you give them much more, and they embody much more, and that has implications outside of it. And we'll talk more about this. I mean, what happens to miscarriages? Is that murder? What happens if they travel outside of the state for an abortion? And it's just ridiculous how far. And this was the most restrictive law until yesterday, which we'll dive into more in terms of the Alabama law. But
it's kind of crazy to see, actually, the fact that it's already progressed so quickly that, you know, this was already bad enough, and then, like, one day, you know, a few days later, we have something so strong.
It just, you know, it's funny because fetuses have to be counted in official population surveys, but I bet undocumented immigrants won't be.
You know, they're counted as 3/5 an individual in, you know, the population survey. I'm not saying that's a callback to anything.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just putting it out there.
You're right, just putting it out there, and we'll unpack that. But the thing is, you know, Georgia, Alabama, and, you know, these really red states, you know, I don't know if this was coordinated. It probably wasn't for this month or so, but you know, they've really pushed back on, you know, abortion and women's rights in a way. And like we'll talk more. Like that was the Georgia law, and that caused a lot of anger, and a lot of people were afraid, rightfully so, because, you know, technically women, if they have miscarriage, could be charged with, like, involuntary manslaughter or something like that because a fetus is now a person. What happens if they travel outside of the state?
I think it's also interesting. I mean, clearly it's coming from the South. This is a very religiously motivated topic. I find it rather hard to get too squeamish about the notion of, you know, women freely choosing to terminate pregnancies unless you are a particularly religious individual. But I've got to say, this definitely shows the kind of rise of, I guess, far-right religious extremism within our own government, right? And you've been seeing a long time, like, these pushes, this is a Christian nation, even though supposedly conservatives care about the Constitution and we have an establishment clause, but this is very much about religion. And I just think that's really interesting. It shows conservatives, once again, only care about the Constitution when it is in their favor.
It's just so absurd in terms of, like, the abortion issue, where they'd go far as to classify fetuses as a person, and they
count them in the census. I think that's rather ridiculous.
They have disdain for people who, you know, are on government support, or, you know, people who might not have papers and are looking for a better life in this country. Yet they'll go so far for fetuses. And, you know, and I've always been a little weird about the whole religious argument, because a lot of people will a lot of Christians will point to the Bible verse where, you know, God tells people, like Adam, to multiply and flourish, and that's where they point to it. And the thing is, I just, you know, like, the religious argument just doesn't hold strong. Like, no matter what religious argument you do, no one's ever gonna most people are not everyone follows the same religion as you are. So some people are irreligious, atheist, agnostic. So
Here.
yeah, it just doesn't make any sense. And what's crazy is, so this was on May 7th. So on May 15th, which was yesterday, this episode is being recorded today on the 16th, that Alabama went further. I know Alabama is known for some crazy stuff. Well,
You're telling me I'm black.
They legit outdone. They've legit outdone Georgia, in terms of abortion rights. So yesterday, the Alabama governor Evie, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but
Ivy,
anyway,
I think maybe.
Ivy. Yeah, she signed the Alabama Human Life Protection Act. Interesting name. And that was approved by the legislature, which is currently Republican-controlled overwhelmingly. And so essentially, this law becomes the most restrictive abortion law in the country. And you know what's ironic? Even the Governor Ivey, has acknowledged that this bill would be unenforceable due to Roe v. Wade, the 1970s landmark decision that legalized abortion and gave us the right to privacy.
That's exactly what I was thinking about. Where does it stand in the face of Roe v. Wade? Because it seems to me to be a rather clear violation, and a lot of these southern states always kind of walk the line. They were like, oh, your hallways need to be this wide to close out most abortion clinics, or you have to deal with someone who will try to convince you not to get an abortion in order to get an abortion. They were always kind of walking the line, but this seems to me to be a rather clear and obvious violation.
Yeah, and we'll get to that point to why they're doing it, right? They're doing this purposefully. I mean, she acknowledges that because the purpose of this bill, this Alabama bill, is to challenge Roe v. Wade in the Supreme Court. Because what's happened in the Supreme Court since the last time they challenged abortion, I believe it was in 2016. Mm-hmm. This was when not Merrick Garland, but when Scalise's seat was empty and it was 8 justices, and they defer back to the lower court ruling, would be in favor of women's rights, and which would be abortion rights. And so the thing is, because now there's a conservative imbalance on the court, they want to challenge it and see if they could eventually overrule Roe v. Wade. Which, to be honest, I kind of think it's unpractical. I mean, the conservative branch on the Supreme Court is it's not as united as you think it is. Mm-hmm. Since Justice Anthony Kennedy resigned and Brett Kavanaugh took his spot, the Chief Justice, I forgot his name, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roberts, right? He's legit become kind of like the swing vote, but also even Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, both the Trump's nominees, have kind of not agreed with each other. Mm-hmm. I think a recent one was the antitrust law ruling, where I've heard that they might have deferred, or they had difference of opinions. But essentially, the abortion laws found in Alabama and even Georgia are to challenge this Roe v. Wade. And what's interesting about the Alabama law is that it only allows exceptions to avoid a serious health risk to the unborn child's mother for ectopic pregnancy, and if the unborn child has a lethal anomaly. But the thing is, there's no exceptions for incest and rape.
Yeah, I mean, so that's definitely true, and that's something we need to consider. I want to ask, where does this leave the Trump presidency? A lot of evangelicals, obviously, I think rather oddly, got behind Trump considering his, whole ungodly record. But they've gotten behind him, and even though these are really decisions on part of the states and they have little, if anything, to do with Trump's administration, they really have nothing to do with it. Do you think this will reflect positively? And this is something that conservative voters around the country will be thinking about when they cast their ballots in 2020.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, so going on for the whole Trump thing, in fact, I think the Trump administration has emboldened these states to pass such restrictive laws. I mean, the Trump administration gave away the Supreme Court to conservatives. Mm-hmm. And so here's the thing. How would voters react to in 2020? This just makes the Republicans look crazy in the red states. Does it appeal to their base? I mean, it depends. Like the Trump base, is the Trump base even extremely concerned with abortion rights? I don't know. I know they're extremely concerned with identity.
So, in general, conservatives, even on the alt-right, right? Like, we've talked to a lot of alt-righters, even on this campus. They have, in my experience, tended to be anti-abortion. even when they consider themselves to be more libertarian, right? Which is where you think that they would be more accepting of it. So I imagine that it may not be their primary issue, but it is an issue that strikes a chord with them.
Well, here's the thing. You know why I think it'll reflect poorly in the Republican Party and why they look crazy? Because even Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, the top of the GOP in Congress, for at least the House, he's legit a GOP leader. Him and the guy in the Senate, I'm blanking out on names right now. But,
Ryan?
Mitch McConnell.
McConnell.
Yeah. Those are the top along with President Trump. He even says the Alabama law goes too far. Granted, Kevin McCarthy's a California Republican.
So go figure.
So he's still pretty much on the right. The thing is, though, he states that it's gone too far, and he says the whole purpose wasn't to bring it to court. But the thing is, it's gotten so much press, and it's made the Republicans look legit, like I said, crazy. They look insane right now. No exceptions for incest and rape. And here's the thing. It criminalizes the procedure, too, in Alabama. So if you're a doctor and you perform an abortion
99
procedure,
years.
You get sentenced to jail.
Here's another thing that made the Republican Party look crazy. Build a wall. But you know what? I mean, it resonated with the base. And Trump is in office. So I don't know if looking crazy is something they're too concerned about. I don't know if it would really damage them if they do come off as crazy.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if you did like a Control F on the Republican platform and you typed in crazy and you found a bunch of mentions of it, like we will be crazy, which is just insane. It's honestly ridiculous how far they're going to in terms of this. And you know, we people have talked about this. A lot of progressives, you know, me and Cole, we're both males. We both identify as men. And so this is a woman's rights issue which I've been referring to. And so, like, I'll acknowledge that there isn't much for me to say, or I mean, I think anyone can give their opinion about anything.
Like clearly we've been talking about it for the last few minutes, but definitely I agree it would be nice to have a woman's perspective, and it kind of highlights on our show the fact that we have not had any women on yet, or, you know, female identifying individuals, and we should probably work to, you know, find people fitting those categories who'd be interested in coming on.
Definitely, and you know, it's just insane how it goes, and we'll keep an eye on the story, but it does not look good for Republicans, I'll tell you that.
Well, I mean, so there I'm sure you want us to get into the other topic, which is very much related to that, but I do want to read some talking points from my favorite conservative, Candace Owens. For some reason, Twitter notifies me anytime she tweets anything, so it's really depressing.
Notifications on for her?
I didn't turn them on, but I guess I've responded to enough of them for Twitter to decide, all right, he's interested. And so go figure. Here's a little thread. 62% of abortions in Alabama are performed on black women. Black women are only 7% of the population, but account for over 40% of all abortions performed in America. Due to abortion, black population growth has stagnated. Planned Parenthood is a voluntary genocide of black America. On to the next one. Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, was an evil genius. She said she hoped to exterminate the blacks like weeds and began educating us about, quote, choice. She is the author of Voluntary Genocide, 18 Million Black Deaths Later, and liberals still defend her dream. Sad. I love how she throws in that, like, Trump-esque, like, sad exclamation mark. I love that. And finally, more black people are killed by abortion annually than by all other causes combined. Where's Black Lives Matter on this? Let's see. Why don't you dump the trash police brutality narrative handed to you by some racist liberals that have oppressed us for decades and go after the PPFA ? And on her Candace Owens show is PragerU, she goes on to talk about abortion even more. So she's been on a rampage with this, and I just want to address some points, right? My first thing is a concept, and this might be crazy to certain people who are too far gone. It's called nuance. And Margaret Sanger, yes, was a eugenist, and her intentions were by no means good, but, you know, as to Candace Owens' point as to how many black abortions there are, let's take a look at the factors behind that, though. Let's take a look at the fact that black families have been broken apart, not only by the legacy of slavery, but also by incarceration, which is still ongoing. Let's look at, you know, and that causes, I mean, if a single woman gets pregnant and she realizes, hey, I don't have the resources to do this on my own, I don't have the familial support, it makes sense that you would want to seek an abortion, especially because under Candace Owens' conservative policies and viewpoints, as to her compatriots as well, there is not a lot of assistance, right, for these people in these situations. And yeah, so that's another, like, undeserving poor myth, right? Like, they deserve to be poor, they don't deserve help and all that stuff, and so we take away, the ability for them to get help, especially in a state like Georgia and Alabama. If we're being honest, they take in so few tax dollars that they actually have to be subsidized by tax dollars from liberal states that tax more. There's not a lot going on there to help them out, but I don't know, maybe if they had a higher minimum wage, maybe if they had, health care, maybe if they had better educational opportunities, they wouldn't feel incentivized to get abortions as much. I personally, in my own life, I 100% support everyone's ability to get an abortion if they need it. But I would probably try to avoid that, through contraceptives and, other things. And I personally would try not to get it, but I live in Fairfield County. I've been afforded an education. I have, a higher minimum wage, and it's my understanding that Connecticut will actually, over the next several years, be officially raising their minimum wage to $15. There's a lot of opportunities here that are not present in Georgia and Alabama. And then also, not to get too far on this, but she talked about, liberals oppressing, blacks. And to some extent, sure, do liberal politicians promise black people moderate concessions and not do anything because they know they're a captive audience, who can't turn to the Republicans because the Republicans are far worse? Sure, absolutely. But she tries to be historical revisionist and assert that the Southern strategy and political realignment never occurred in this country. And that's just unequivocally false. That's some Dinesh D'Souza type falsities, and there's been so much ink spilled talking about this already that it's really redundant that we keep having to have these same conversations, and it's just rather annoying. One last point on Candace Owens. The police brutality narrative is not a narrative handed down to us. It has come about rather organically within the black community, and it's been simmering for decades because it's true. Look at the black incarceration rates. Even if we were to insist that blacks commit more crimes, the amount of black men in jail is still inappropriate for that increase in crime and criminal activity, right? Mm-hmm. It's not a narrative, or rather, it's not a false narrative. It's one that has not gotten nearly enough attention over the years. So I just wanted to point out that conservative viewpoint before moving on to another conservative figure.
Yeah, so I'm thinking that, Candace Owens is just... I don't even want to talk about her, but the thing
I can't believe she's from Connecticut. Like, as a black person from Connecticut, like, I feel like I have to talk about her this much so I could, wash my hands of her and, really say, she's not one of us.
So, yeah, I guess another big conservative figure that we're going to talk about, and he relates to this topic, was Ben Facts Don't Care About Your Feelings Shapiro.
Actually, it's Ben Facts Don't Care About Your Feelings Shapiro. That's how you do it.
That was pretty good.
Thank you.
He felt a little passionate with an interview with a British journalist known as Andrew Neil on BBC, the British Broadcasting something, right?
Channel?
Oh, company.
Broadcast.
I was
going to say company, but then it's publicly funded.
No, the British Broadcasting Corporation.
Oh, okay.
We were close. Anyway. So basically, Neil pushed on Shapiro about Georgia's abortion law, which we discussed about, and Neil stated that the Georgia law, or anti-abortion laws like Georgia, even Alabama, would take us back to the Dark Ages. And then Wimpy Shapiro was completely caught off guard, starts rambling and doesn't even answer the question, or address Neil's statements, and then starts questioning Neil's credentials and asks if he's an objective or an opinion journalist.
And he insists that he's clearly liberal and doesn't make sense. So this was crazy to watch, the difference between British broadcasting and American broadcasting. Because in America, Ben Shapiro is hailed as the cool kid's philosopher, to quote the New York Times. Was it Barry Weiss who wrote that? I feel like that would be a Barry Weiss piece.
It's probably a Barry Weiss piece.
But regardless, right? Cool kid's philosopher. How pretentious. But beyond that, right? So he's hailed as this calm, rational, logical guy. But really, I mean, going to the UK and trying his same hacky tactics where he says, I've never heard of you. I've never heard. Like, he didn't do any research, right? Because he insisted that he was a liberal. But this guy has been hired by Rupert Murdoch. He's a part of the Murdoch, aristocracy.
Andrew Neil he operates the conservative journalist known as The Spectator in the UK. Ben Shapiro, like you said, did not do his homework. He went on, he was caught off guard, he was confronted directly, and he just was obliterated when when you start attacking someone's credentials instead of and dismissing the question or the statements that they present to you. Mm-hmm. You've just lost the debate. I mean,
so I'm going to push back on that a bit, and I think you and I are on the same page, but you just worded it a little off. Mm-hmm. Because, for example, if I criticize the credentials of Jordan B. Peterson, you're a psychologist. Don't talk about Marx because all you read is the Communist Manifesto and a very bare bones read of it too. So stop talking about economics, right? That is a valid criticism of credentials, but the issue is he did not look into his credentials. Then he tried to project left-wing credentials onto him and then dismiss his points outright as a result when that just wasn't justified, mm-hmm. right? So that's the big issue. And I think it also shows how vapid conservative politics are, in America at least, because this guy, right, whose name is Neil, right?
Neil, his name is Andrew Neil.
Andrew Neil, right? He is, once again, a conservative from, the UK. And he points out, rightly so, that the conservative politicians of America don't have any new ideas. They don't have any ideas about climate change. Their ideas about abortion haven't really changed. They have not evolved as a party, except to get more polarized, I suppose. But they haven't created any new ideas, any new solutions to the problems facing the country, right? Mm-hmm. How new is xenophobia? Come on. And a right-winger, from across the pond very clearly criticizes that. And Ben Shapiro said something along the lines of, we have conversations about climate change. Great. But no conversations that come up with policy. And instead of saying, hey, no, actually here are the ideas that we have, he just freaks out and he got triggered. He was, he basically was a snowflake and he melted, right?
Let's dive into his, how he was triggered, right? I'm gonna read off a few quotes. He goes throughout the interview. He displays such arrogance and such ignorance too, where he says, "quote This is a giant waste of time in the sense that the entire interview is designed for you to shout slogans or old things that I've said at me." Unquote. And
I'm sorry. Could you please try to read it like a Ben Shapiro voice,
I can't do a Ben Shapiro voice. You can read. You have the quotes right in front of you. You can read them a Ben Shapiro voice. So I guess the next quote, that's all you, Colin.
All right, let's see. Which quote are we on? Are we on
the second one?
The objective.
I'm not.
Oh, okay. I'm not inclined to continue with an interview with a person as badly motivated as you. And
then it's really, Ben? Anyone who disagrees with Ben is badly motivated. Right? So much for this is the dude who's always civil discourse. He's not Dave Rubin, but he plays off Dave Rubin.
Just care about ideas.
Just care about ideas, exactly.
And once again, you can criticize someone's motivations. We criticize motivations of the mainstream Democratic Party all the time, right? But we have theories, we have information, and we have outcomes to back it up, right? What is this new group of moderate Democrats coming together with industry lobbyists on vacations to talk about how to defeat Medicare for all? That's very clearly bad faith, because that is an industry just objectively influencing policy outcomes by buying people vacations, right? Mm-hmm. And we can clearly talk about that, but to call once again a right-winger who's just pushing back and saying, hey, what are your ideas? Do you have any new ideas? And challenging you as opposed to just standing and letting you get like trample all over them and just accepting your ideas without like actually like criticizing them or thinking critically about them as bad faith. That's really disingenuous.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, Neil pushed on Ben about how Ben said something about Arabs, about wanting to live in like sewers and like blowing stuff up, and like Shapiro responds.
The West builds. Arabs live in sewers.
Well, that's the thing. And Ben has come out and he's written a whole article about all the stupid shit he said.
And I mean that's a good start, but the next step would be deleting the Daily Wire.
Exactly. I mean, I'm all for that. But the thing is, you said all this and you can come out and you can repudiate all that, right? But the thing is, Ben, regardless of not if he did, he just showed such arrogance and Benny Boy didn't do his homework.
He really did not do. He walked on. He had no idea, like, who his interviewer was. As he kept reminding them, he had no idea what the BBC was, which is absolutely absurd, right? Especially to think he's in media. How do you not know about the BBC, dude?